Welcome to Korean Treasures series, part 2 of highlights from the Harvard Art Museums. My name is Shine Park. I am Associate Professor of East Asian Languages and Civilizations at Harvard University and a scholar and teacher of Korean literature. Today's talk is the part 2 of the two-part series, and the focus today is, very excitingly, ceramics as icons of Korean culture, highlights from the Harvard Art Museums. Harvard Art Museums has a very rich collection of Korean ceramics, and also ranging from 5th century Silla pottery to the famed Goryeo celadon to Joseon porcelain. And we're very excited because our speaker, Dr. Soyoung Lee, is also an expert in Korean ceramics. Our speaker today, Dr. Soyoung Lee, is the Landon and Lavinia Clay Chief Curator at the Harvard Art Museums. She oversees the museum's exhibitions program and curatorial vision for acquiring and presenting the collections, adding to the Harvard Art Museum's already impressive collection numbering around 255,000 objects spanning the globe and from ancient times to today. Dr. Lee also directs the Art Museum's training program of curatorial, conservation, and education fellows. Most recently, in fall 2022, she co-organized, along with her colleague curator Sarah Larson, a special installation of Harvard's Korean art collection in conjunction with the 40th anniversary celebration of Harvard's Korea Institute. Now, Soyoung's areas of curatorial expertise and research interests include Korean and Japanese ceramics from 1400s to 1900s, issues of cross-cultural exchanges in East Asia and contemporary Asian art. Between 2003 and 2018, Dr. Lee worked at the Metropolitan Museum of Art as the Met's first curator for Korean art. In that role, she contributed to raising the profile of Korean art and culture in the United States. Her exhibitions and publications include Diamond Mountains, Travel and Nostalgia in Korean Art in 2018, highlighting the symbolic place of the iconic Kumgang Mountains in Korean cultural history. Excuse me. There's also Silla, Korea's Golden Kingdom, published in 2013, a major blockbuster show co-organized with the National Museum of Korea and Gyeongju National Museum. And third, Poetry in Clay, Korean Buncheong ceramics from Lium Samsung Museum of Art in 2011. I am very, very excited to give Dr. Lee to you. Thank you very much. And please, Dr. Lee, take it away from here.
Thank you, Professor Shine Park, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you so much for hosting this Korean Treasures presentation. So hello, everybody. I think many of you joined me for the first lecture. Now, that was in February, more than a month ago, and I'm so pleased that a lot of you have joined me again. As Shina said, in my current role at the Harvard Art Museums, I don't actually specifically work with the Korean collection, but it's always a pleasure to come back to playing with Korean ceramics in particular, and I'm just so grateful for this opportunity that the Korea Institute has provided. And again, a personal thanks to Shina and also Sunju. And Shina, maybe later on in the Q&A, we can talk, or Shina can talk a little bit about how she uses the Harvard Art Museum's collections for her teaching. And to remind everybody that, in fact, the collections of the Harvard Art Museums are available for teaching, for individual research, for viewing. So not only in our galleries, but also through our amazing art study center, where you can request through our online collections. And our Harvard partners, at least, are incredibly active in using our collections for teaching, which really pleases me to no end. I will now share my screen, and hopefully I know how to do that. We did practice this earlier, so hopefully you can see my screen, and I will put it on. Okay, Alrighty. So today I'm going to highlight our collection of Korean ceramics, just a few samples to go through some of its history and the highlights of Korean ceramic history, and really honing in on this idea of ceramics as the Korean sort of national icon, particularly in the presentation of Korean art history in Western museums. So just wanted to begin with this iPhone shot, and you can see me. I'm realizing you can see me reflected in the case here. A case of Korean ceramics, some of our best examples from Korea and Joseon Dynasty that's actually currently still on view, has been on for over a year on the second floor in the arcades before you enter into the East Asian galleries. And this will remain on view, I believe, through the summer. Probably will change around the beginning of the fall. So if you are nearby or around or visiting, please make sure to check this out on the second floor. And so we'll begin actually with the earliest celadon that entered the collection in 1919. It's so high, so it's not a large piece of celadon, but as I think many of you, all of you know, celadon is among the quintessential sort of Korean icon, certainly beginning in the early 20th century for both East Asian and European and American collectors and audiences. Celadon very basically is a high-fired stoneware. So it has nothing to do with stone, it's just a technical term. Stoneware just means high-fired ceramic. Typically the clay, when it fires to a nice sort of gray base. So it's not porcelain, the clay is not white. But the celadon term and color derives from the really the glaze with a little bit of iron content that brings out this incredibly beautiful green color, which of course, as many of you know, was touted as one of the best things about Korean culture, or even surpassing the Chinese version in its lifetime by Soyoung Chinese. We have those in the historical records. This is a classic example of Baebyung, which literally it's a Korean transliteration of the Chinese term and characters maping. So literally means plum bottle or plum vase. And often this shape, which has this very unique mouth and a voluptuous shoulder and tapering out a little bit, is not unique to Korea, and this form exists in Chinese ceramics as well, but in modern times has been, I think, more uniquely identified with Korean ceramics, and particularly Korean celadon, as something that's distinctive. This is a beautiful example of both the glaze color and this subtle decoration just under the glaze that's carved with wonderful floral motifs. The Maebyung, of course, is probably most familiar to you or best known in its inlaid decorative combination, inlay being where if you look at these three, you'll think that they're maybe painted onto the surface. But in fact, before the green glaze is applied, the beautiful, wonderful lyrical designs on the surface are created by carving into the clay before it's completely dried, and then really finely carved. And then the carved grooves or the lines are filled with clay that's either white or an iron-rich sort of reddish clay. And once fired, the iron-rich clay turns black. So it has this white and black contrast with the beautiful green glaze. The point being that it's a lot more time consuming, requiring higher level of skill and patience and delicacy than simply brushing onto the surface. And it does seem to be, if not an invention, certainly a distinctive form of technical technique that the Korean potters, particularly during the Goryeo period, developed and really made their own. We do know that there's maybe one or two examples of inlaid celadon discovered from archaeological sites in China, but it is not a format that is known really typically of Chinese ceramics, celadon or otherwise. So it really is something that that is inlaid celadon is something that Koryo has been known for, as distinctive for. Here are two other examples that are currently on view that is slightly unusual, in the sense that the one on the right is an example of inlay, but it's what we call reverse inlay. So rather than the decoration, rather than the motif, it's the background that's been carved and inlaid, filled in with clay. So it's a slightly more unusual method than the typical inlaid celadon. The vase on the right, which is also a type of mebyang, doesn't look particularly green to you. It has this olive yellowish tone, but it's the result of a type of kind of different kind of firing within the kiln that really changes the color into this olive green. This here, the surface decoration is actually brushed on with an iron-rich pigment under the celadon glaze. So even though the color appearance seems not quite green, this is all classified as celadon. So those are just some of the examples that are currently on view, but I'd like to focus now on the core of our Korean ceramic collection, which is the Gregory and Maria Henderson collection of Korean ceramics. And these are some of our highlights. Gregory and Maria were lived and stationed in Seoul in South Korea, first in 1948, then returned in 1958, I believe until about 1963. So Mr. Henderson was posted to Seoul as a political officer of the US Embassy. And during their time, they really developed a love and passion for Korean culture, and particularly ceramics, and amassed a generous collection of Korean ceramics from many periods, from the Three Kingdoms through Goryeo to Chosun. And it's actually really in the early periods, the Three Kingdoms. Let's see what I have next. I'll come to that, but this is, and so they collected early ceramics as well as Goryeo celadon and Chosun period porcelain and puncheongware, quite a wide range. And in 1993, Maria Henderson, by then a widow, donated, was a partial donation, partial purchase to the Harvard Art Museums. It was a major gift, a major acquisition by the museums. At this point, until this collection entered the Harvard Art Museums, the museum's collection of Korean ceramics certainly did not have that kind of breadth, and it continues to remain the core of our Korean ceramics, used often in teaching and for research as well. I'm showing you a picture of Maria Henderson, and also just some of the media attention around the 1993 exhibition following the gift and acquisition of this collection, really featuring the very personal story of how these were collected, what it meant to the collectors, and really kind of evidencing the impact and meaning during that time in the 90s of a collection of this caliber being acquired by a US museum, particularly a teaching academic museum, and the impact of that. I should note, I believe it's in this one, that you can imagine some of the questions at the time, certainly to the question of Korean heritage being gifted to an entity or an institution outside of Korea. Ceramics are, of course, as you know, an art form that was produced in multitudes and in large quantity. It's actually one of the reasons why most collections of Korean art outside of Korea, and certainly in the West, comprise mainly ceramics, just because there's a lot of them and many were able to be collected, and at the same time had such distinctive characteristics that really distinguish them from their East Asian counterparts, Chinese and Japanese. So just to note that even at the time, there was a potential raised around whether Korean heritage should remain in Korea. I mean, obviously these were collected in the 50s and 60s and returned to the US with the Hendersons, but it was not an issue. And in fact, in this article points out that the collection, while excellent quality, there is nothing that is of designated national treasures, and that there is nothing that is so rare that there are no counterparts in Korea. And so it's that the fact that these were able to be gifted and presented to an institution in the US only helps amplify the spread of Korean culture and the impact of learning about and appreciation for Korean culture. So this exhibition and an accompanying symposium in the 1990s, organized by our former curator of Chinese and Korean art, of Asian art, Rob Mary. Some of you will be very familiar with him. He was a major figure within the field of Asian art history, and a proponent of one who actually really promoted Korean art and collecting of Korean art in the US. So this was a kind of a landmark acquisition, exhibition, and symposium in the around the mid-90s, and featured in both Korean press and in the US press, including around the wonderful story of how the Hendersons came to love and acquire Korean ceramics. And I should say that in that way, the Korean ceramics collection at Harvard is unusual in that the collection was formed by Americans who had knowledge of, had lived in, and truly appreciated the culture and the art. In many of the major museums in the US, the Metropolitan Museum included, the initial early collections of Korean ceramics are often formed and purchased through Japan-based or Japanese dealers, and formed by collectors who did not necessarily, in fact, almost all of them did not travel to Korea if they were formed in the first half or mid part of the 20th century. And so there's a certain distance between the collector and the collecting and the art and the culture itself, whereas the Hendersons were very much based in and deeply invested in the Korean culture. So that sets this collection apart from collections of Korean ceramics throughout the US and most of Europe as well. As I said, among the areas, among the section of Korean ceramics that is especially strong within the Henderson collection is the early material, the Three Kingdoms, Shilla and Kaya in particular, really set off by this distinctive characteristic of they're also high-fired stoneware, but they are not glazed. So this is not Celadon. This, in fact, predates the development of Celadon. So the whole technology of glazing, of applying a glassy surface and then firing again, it predates that whole tradition. And as I think many of you know, ceramics of this early period, for the most part, were produced sometimes for daily use or ritual, but often as well as to be buried in these magnificent tombs, to basically travel, for the deceased to travel or use with them in their next life. And they all have these very distinctive looks of pedestals for the most part, and they do tend to be large pedestals with open work and sort of surface incised decoration that really sets them apart from ceramics that comes after and ceramics elsewhere, except ceramics similar period in Japan, which were very much influenced by this aesthetic. And here's a really wonderful example in the collection, not atypical, but not all that usual, and that there are also some that have these abstracted, almost modernist looking, but somewhat representational designs, specifically horse, although I'm calling them horses, but they probably look more like zebras to us. I don't believe zebras were known at the time. So these are sort of abstracted renderings of horse-like animals, which were, of course, a part of that culture at the time. Now, returning to Celadon, which also forms a good part of the Henderson collection, these are three really outstanding examples of Celadon. As you can see, again, it's in the color that really identifies the Celadon tradition. And we have a range of both subtle incised or carved design under the glaze in the two on the one in the middle and the one on the right, as well as a wonderful, beautiful, delicate example of inlaid Celadon on the left, which is really known as it's so big. So it's I know the scale is kind of wacky on the screen. The little oil bottle on your left is a tiny miniature item that we call oil bottles because we think that they were used to contain oils for cosmetic purposes, but potentially for hair and so forth. The two on the right, of course, would have been related to drinking, either wine or tea. And Celadon, and let's see if I have the right slide, just to situate that we do actually know a lot about production centers and consumer sites. So of course, the capital of Korea at the time was Kaesong, which is, I'm sorry, it is not on this map because it's only of today's South Korea. Kaesong now located just across the border in what is today's North Korea. So slightly in the north, but the central production centers of Celadon or Cheongja were located in the southwestern portion of Korea. So in Cholla mostly in the Cholla province. And not surprising, in part, it's the richness of the raw materials, clay, but also the proximity to China. Because as I think you all know, Celadon is a tradition and technology that first developed in China and very directly was influenced, at least in the initial stages. And then in terms of its aesthetic and stylistic development, of course, the Korean Celadons, particularly with inlaid Celadon, really went its own way, really separating its identity from the Chinese prototypes. Before I move on to Puncheong, I do want to say, in terms of the concept of national icon, Celadons as a distinctive representative of Korean traditional culture emerged in the early part of the 20th century, and it really is a result of the Japanese colonial sort of history and Japanese colonial collecting and archaeological work in the early part of the 20th century. And it's through the Japanese excavations and the Japanese dealers and Japanese aesthetics that Korean Celadon, Korea Celadon, which really at that point had not been known as well, certainly outside of Korea, emerged as an icon or a really important part of traditional Korean culture for Western collectors, for museums, and for museum-going audiences. Chosun ceramics, on the other hand, came to be known a little bit later, certainly for Western audiences. Now, again, for the Japanese collectors, and you will know the name Yanagi Muneyoshi, of course, the whole movement of Mingei or folk art within Japan that developed during the early part of the 20th century, what would be Japanese colonial period in Korea, and had very direct consequences for how Korean art came to be seen in Japan and Korea, but perhaps most importantly for our purposes in the West. So really filtered through that notion of both elevating Chosun ceramics as an art form that is pure and simple, but at the same time, this notion of the art of a sad nation, right? That's very much infused into the Mingei aesthetic Mingei philosophy of its view on Korean ceramics. So Chosun porcelain in particular came to be promoted through those circles and that lens. Now, Puncheong is a really particular and interesting category and has an interesting history. No doubt many of you, if not all of you, are familiar or have seen Puncheong types. But Puncheong sagi, which literally means ceramic or stoneware that is covered in white powder is a type of ceramic that really developed out of the Celadon tradition. And in fact, initially, it's the Celadon kilns that started experimenting and producing what becomes known as punchang. And really, this category of ceramics were only produced for about a 200-year history. So from the end of the 14th century, very end of Koryo in the transition into Joseon, till about not quite even into 1600. So right around or before Hideyoshi's invasion of Korea, which is not necessarily the reason punchang died out. It was already dying out in Korea because of overwhelming preference for white porcelain. But certainly the Hideyoshi's invasion, which did the result of that invasion being the mass transfer of potters as well as other skilled and unskilled laborers to Japan, really did stop this whole tradition of punchang. And then within Joseon, porcelain took off even more. The entire sort of social stratum within Joseon, and not just the royal court, began coveting and producing and consuming porcelain. So punchang essentially disappears from the Korean peninsula as a ceramic tradition until it is revived by modern potters in the 20th century. So we'll get to maybe a little bit of that later, and I'm happy to answer questions around that later. But these are two wonderful examples of punchang. Punchang basically is similar in clay, but much coarser, less refined, and it's sort of a competition with porcelain, or a conscious but cheaper imitation of porcelain, in the sense that rather than sourcing clay that is white, it's much harder to produce porcelain. Punchang basically takes white kind of clay powder and covers the surface. And there are many different techniques that are employed. The one on the left is inlaid. So like Cheongja, right, like Celadon inlay, it takes that existing technique of carving out the clay with design, carving out the surface of a vessel with design, and then filling in the carved portions with white clay before covering with a glaze and firing. But as you can see in the example on the left, unlike Celadon, this is a much sort of rougher, shall we say, coarser, and you can see that the surface covered with white is a lot more than was with Celadon. So it's a more experimental, shall we say, a more robust, less sort of elegant and refined version or aesthetic that really did begin with, but took off in a very different direction. And we also have examples like those on the right. And by the way, these are both on view on the second floor at the Harvard Art Museums. And the one on the right is an example where the technique involves brushing almost the entire surface of the vessel with white slip basically being watered down clay, and then carving through the slip so that you have this almost, again, sort of abstract modern painting-like design on punchang. That is what it's best known for. And this employs iron-rich pigment to kind of do this wild brush strokes over the surface. Another type of punchang that was seemed to have been particularly popular in the end of the 15th, early part of the 16th century, particularly around the Chungcheongdo Gongju region. And today is sort of held up as an example of, punchang that is reminiscent of or captures in the early 16th century what we today think of as modern sort of abstract art, right? That sense of experimental spirit. Again, just to remind you, another example, this is of a bowl and cover, or perhaps two bowls that are used as a bowl and a cover. Again, how it is, punchang is sort of a descendant of inlaid Celadon. It's very much uses that technique, but employs stamps. So it's a little bit more mass produced. The thing that's notable here is, and again, to remember where punchang started, is as ceramics really that were intended for the government or the central court. And you'll notice that there are Chinese characters stamped on there. This one is, it's Seongju Janghungo. So it's the name of a place, and Janghungo meaning one of the bureaus, government bureaus. And so part of how Puncheong started and how its production was controlled was that Puncheong was produced in the regions, not, so by the time this is Chosun now, so the capital being Hanyang or today's Seoul, and that's where the court and the government is centered, but the Puncheong was produced mostly throughout the country in the regions, and to control for quality and to control for production amounts, many of them were required to be inscribed or stamped with names of government bureaus. We can talk more about this at the end. I'm just trying to make sure that I don't take up too much time and go through the slides. Very quickly, this is an example that is, as you can see, has the Puncheong look. I'm still actually figuring out whether this would have been produced on the Korean Peninsula or potentially was produced in Japan during the Edo period, so post 17th century. So this gets at Puncheong's afterlife once it is no longer produced in Chosun. During that time, from about 1600 to the 20th century, when it gets revived in Korea. Puncheong as an aesthetic, not a direct copy, but kind of as a revival. There's a pretty significant movement that happens in Japan. And if I have a map, mostly around the Kyushu area, but also smatterings in kind of central Honshu, where either descendants of Korean potters or those unrelated will take up the technique and the motifs familiar from Puncheong, but with clay and glaze and slightly developed motifs that are very Japanese. And so it develops into kind of a revivalist, but nonetheless Japanese tradition from about the 17th through the 19th century. So it has this afterlife in a different region and a different culture and taking on a visual look that is reminiscent of and yet rather departing from the original Korean aesthetic. Now, porcelain, whiteware, is something that, of course, originates in China, spreads to west to the Islamic world, east to first in Korea, where porcelain really becomes all the rage within Chosun culture. It's one of the reasons that Puncheong as a tradition dies out. And Koreans, of course, as many of you know, unlike China and Japan, where colorful porcelain really becomes the norm and the dominant form, and those both blue and white and colored enameled porcelain are the types that then gets circulated, exported, and coveted and imitated in Europe. The Chosun court really does emphasize sort of undecorated, pure white porcelain. And one of the forms, one of the genre that is quite distinctive within Chosun porcelain is what today is known as dalhangari, or moon jar, this globular porcelain jar that is undecorated. And whereas ceramics in general are fairly universal in its forms, right? There are many forms that share it across cultures, and pretty standard. And yet this particular shape, you don't see in China or in Japan. So in the modern period and including continuing today, the moon jar has been kind of taken up as perhaps the icon of Korean visual culture. And certainly with ceramics, there are many articles have been written about it. The Koreans themselves promote it as such. And the National Palace Museum, for example, probably probably more than a decade ago, showcased an exhibition only of moon jars. There are not that many that are really large and of a standard that would be considered sort of national treasure level. And so they mounted this exhibition, again, kind of promoting this as an incredible icon of traditional Korean culture for today's audiences. And Professor Charlotte Horlick in London SOAS recently published an article on this whole notion of moon jar as cultural icon. This is an example in the Harvard Art Museums. As you can see, it does have sort of surface impurities, shall we call it? And it's part of the original process of production, but also the fact that subsequently, because the surface is not entirely non-porous, that through use, you do get a bit of sort of coloring on it, which I think are considered part of the aging process and part of its history. Moon jar, by the way, one of the characteristic features of it is how it's produced, because they're large, often, so in centimeters, more than 30, often exceeding 40 centimeters. And because of the nature of the Korean clay that was used, if you form an entire bulbous jar on the wheel, it will tend to collapse. And so they typically were formed as two halves, two bow-like halves that were joined. And so you will see the seam in the center, in the joint, and that's part of its appeal. But again, that is the kind of the typical characteristic of how it was produced. We also, in addition to an 18th century, and by the way, moon jar is typically began to be produced in the 17th century, has its sort of height in 18th, continues into the 19th century. We also have an example of a work by a contemporary artist. Now, many modern and particularly contemporary artists have taken up the moon jar, again, the cultural icon for Korea, and put their own spin on them. One of the artists who've sort of really hewed closely to the traditional moon jar, but have exploded them to a size that's even larger than traditional moon jars is Park Young-suk, a contemporary artist. And in this photo is an example of Park Young-suk's contemporary piece that was exhibited in a small installation show called around Asian ceramics, Pan-Asian ceramics, in our study gallery not too long ago. So, okay. I was in Korea recently, and the National Museum had an interesting display of their moon jar with kind of, really highlighting this connection with the moon, which is not necessarily something that's documented or that we know that the Chosun people made, but it's certainly something that is re-emphasizing how it's viewed today. So just an interesting example of installations from the National Museum of Korea. And then, of course, moon jar as a cultural icon in the modern period also, I think many of you know about how certain artists, modern artists, also took this iconography or this motif or this cultural icon into their own art. Kim Hwan-gi, whose photo is here in this slide, being one of the most prominent artists who featured the moon jar or his interpretation of the moon jar in his paintings. An example of one of the better known moon jars in Korean collections. This is from the Amore Pacific Museum in Seoul, Korea, but an exhibition. I'm just took a couple of photos that I thought would be relevant for this talk. This is from an exhibition that happened to be on view at the Samsung Museum of Art, a very special exhibition on Chosun ceramics when I was in Seoul in March. And so a wonderful example. And I don't know if some of you will recognize, my daughter texted me saying, guess what, RM of BTS went to that very same show that we saw. I don't know if many of you know, RM from BTS has now become known as an art enthusiast and collector, and he apparently goes around to exhibitions and posts himself and encourages people to attend art shows. And this is the Samsung Museum of Art show on Korean ceramics, Chosun ceramics in particular. 3 wonderful examples of Chosun blue and white, that is porcelain painted with cobalt blue on the surface before it's covered in clear glaze. Mostly sort of late 18th into 19th century examples of jars painted in this wonderful kind of calligraphic painterly brushwork representing floral motifs, or on the left, it's a rather unusual and fun shape of a square bottle that probably you would have been used in a Confucian scholar's study, featuring plum branch or plum blossoms. So blue and white is as with porcelain in general, becomes a global phenomenon. Again, produced in China first, spreads to West, to Persia, to the Islamic worlds, to Korea, and then from Korea to Japan, and then through Chinese and Japanese exports, because the Chosun porcelain, for the most part, circulated domestically and then within East Asia to China and Korea a little bit, but really was not exported to Europe. And so, which is why it really wasn't known in the West until the 20th century, whereas Chinese and Japanese porcelains circulated to Europe and became all the rage, and of course was copied, and Europeans produced their own versions. But it really then, by the 18th century, becomes a global phenomenon. Another wonderful example of blue and white porcelain in the Harvard Art Museum's collection. This has a personal kind of connection for me. This is a jar, 18th century jar known as a dragon jar, featuring obviously a motif of dragons chasing a jewel. This is a fairly standard, wonderful example of late Chosun porcelain. It, in its original form, would have been used as sort of flower vases in imperial or court rituals. And we have court documents that show dragon jars used in those functions. But this particular jar was gifted to the Harvard Art Museums in 2003 by a former Radcliffe, Marie-Hélène Weil, who went to Radcliffe at a time when Harvard, prior to Harvard admitting women. But Mrs. Weil, Marie-Hélène, was actually also, and her husband were collectors of Chinese East Asian art and were also supporters of the Met. I joined the Met in 2003. And once I got to know Marie-Hélène, she had told me that she had just given to the Harvard Art Museum this wonderful vase, or wonderful jar. And I remember thinking, why couldn't it have come to the Met? But who would have known I'd be at Harvard many years later. And now I get to see this piece here in person and enjoy the piece. This is an example in the Lium's collection, again, that I saw in a recent show. And as you can see, if you count the claws of the dragon, there are 5 claws, which, as many of you'll know, is dragons with 5 claws are imperial symbol, particularly with the king or the emperor. Both in China and Korea, 4 claws straddles between king and prince. And so 5 claws is like the ultimate, the top dragon, right? The top dragon jar. And that's how one recognizes ones that probably would have been used in court rituals and ceremonies and celebrations. I want to end with a work that was recently gifted to the Harvard Art Museums, in fact, by our former curator of Asian art, Bob Mary, by a person who was close to Harvard with the Korea Institute, Nam-hee Kim Wagner, who was a longtime professor, a teacher of Korean language here at Harvard, and was a ceramist. And this is a wonderful reinterpretation of the Puncheong tradition, as I think many of you will recognize. It's a fairly large, deep bowl that is her interpretation of the carved decoration tradition of Puncheong. So this is where the white slip would have been applied, and she would have carved out the motif as well as the backgrounds to elevate sort of in high relief the peonies and leaves. And just to leave you with an impression of its underside as well as a detail you can really see and feel the tactile quality. So puncheong is very much, even though it had disappeared from the Korean peninsula for hundreds of years, revived in Japan, revived again in modern Korea by potters, is very much alive as a tradition and an inspiration for contemporary artists today, and remains sort of, an iconic example of Korean art for contemporary audiences. So with that, I will stop sharing and hand it over to Professor Park.